All right, so we're back talking about the Felicity conditions for these various speech acts. So, what are those conditions? If you think about timeout in the context of a sporting contest, then there's certain conditions that apply. So there's a limited number of timeouts a team has during a particular competition. Maybe 3 timeouts per half, like in football or something like that. So you need to have at least 1 timeout left in order to make the utterance of timeout actually valid. And then there's other certain conditions like in basketball you have to be in possession of the football, or sorry, in basketball you have to be in possession of the basketball. It would be interesting if you had to be in possession of football and basketball, but I'm not going to go there. Other conditions like that have to hold in order for this to actually work. There has to be time running on the clock, so on and so forth. Shotgun, these conditions get kind of interesting because different groups of people have different conditions for whether or not this is valid. Some people think, well, you have to actually be like going in the direction of the car, so on and so forth. Or maybe some people say you actually have to be the car has to be in your sight in order for you to be able to utter this, so on and so forth. And there are other conditions like that. In Jinx, what I'm thinking here is simply that, the only primary condition that has to be met is that 2 people have to say something at the exact same time, and then you can say Jinx. You can't just say Jinx out of the blue at some random time and use that to get somebody to stop talking, however convenient or pleasant that might otherwise be. So there are conditions on all these expressions in order for them to actually be able to apply. When somebody attempts to perform a speech act, like Michael Scott in The Office, when the appropriate Felicity conditions have not been met, the speech act is said to be infelicitous. So Felicity conditions, I'll just mention here before I go too far. Felicity is kind of derived from a Latin root, which means happy. So these are kind of like happiness conditions for the speech acts that have to be satisfied in order for the whole event to be copacetic. All right, so I'll give you some just cartoon examples of infelicity that I got from a semantics textbook a while back. So this guy is saying, did this dude who is smoking have that cigarette? Like an order, but that doesn't make any sense because he's already smoking the cigarette, so it's too late. That's infelicitous. Here is a peasant girl saying, you may go now, your majesty. And he's looking grumpy because she does not have the power in hand to be able to tell him what to do. Similarly, here's a little kid telling their grandparents, you ought to be ashamed of your disgraceful behavior. They're looking like what the heck? Something that's kind of funny, though, is that little kids will sometimes perform infelicitous speech acts because they kind of haven't figured out the pattern here, that somebody in a position of authority over them could tell them to do this, but they just repeat what is going on around them before getting all the details straight sometimes. And this person's getting punched in the face and says, thank you very much. Yeah. Unless they're a masochist, probably not, right? So these are infelicitous speech acts. They're not working. If you walk through this and try to figure out what exactly are these felicity conditions, they get kind of mind-numbingly boring, but I'll just show you some examples here. Let's say there's some speaker who asks somebody else, did the Flames beat the Oilers last night? And so within this question, there's what we call a proposition, which is just sort of the declarative form of the sentence by itself. The Flames beat the Oilers last night. Sadly, they did not play, but maybe someday in the future, hopefully soon. So there are felicity conditions for this speech act to actually work as a question, and I'm just sort of calling this a proposition here so I can refer to it just by as a P when I talk about the felicity conditions. So one of those conditions is that the speaker does not know whether the proposition is true or not, whether the Flames beat the Oilers. The speaker wants to know whether that proposition is true. The speaker believes the hearer knows that information, and the speaker believes that the hearer can share information about the propositions. So these are step-by-step all the conditions that kind of have to apply for this to work as a question. And you can stop and think about it, that oftentimes people use questions not exactly in this manner, and they're using the question for maybe a different kind of speech act. So for instance, in a teaching context, your instructor may often ask questions where this condition does not apply, where the speaker may know the answer to the question, but just wants to find out whether you know the answer to the question, right? So rather than wanting to know the proposition itself, the speaker would want to know whether you know the truth value of the proposition, right? Sometimes people ask questions or do speech acts simply to say, show off the fact that they know something that you don't as well. That sometimes happens in teaching context too. There's all sorts of different ways you can use what looks like a question on the surface in a not question manner, basically. Okay, so that leads me into sentence type versus sentence use. So there are three basic sentence types, syntactically speaking, in language. So we get declaratives, we get interrogatives, and we get imperatives. And I'm going to, on the next slide, lay out how these differ syntactically, but the difference between these three is just based on syntax alone. But each one has a specific speech act that it's sort of prototypically used for. So declarative sentences are typically used in assertions. We saw one before. I think John read the book is what it was. When you use declarative sentence as an assertion, you're simply conveying information about what is true and what is false about the world. Some knowledge or information about the world. Like LeBron James plays basketball, true. Maybe not now, but in general. The dog ate my homework, hopefully not true. Linguistics is fun, definitely true. So all these things are just assertions about the way the world is, and they're using the declarative sentence type. Interrogative sentences are typically used in questions, and the goal here is to elicit information from the hearer. That's the act that they're being used for. So we saw an example a slide ago. Did the Flames beat the Oilers last night? Is it snowing again? Turns out the answer to that one is yes at the moment, on April 3rd. And so lastly, we have an imperative sentence, which are typically used in orders and requests, and those are meant to affect the behavior of the hearer. So these are expressions like stop it or tell me what happened, so on and so forth. So just to let you know, I might come back here, but each sentence type has a distinct syntactic structure. So a declarative sentence has this structure that we've normally been seeing in most of our syntax examples. So like LeBron James plays basketball, that's subject, verb, object, and crucially the subject is coming before the verb here. In an interrogative sentence, you invert the order of the subject and auxiliary verb. So did the Flames beat the Oilers? The verb, the auxiliary verb at least, is coming before the subject here. That's part of what makes this, or that's effectively what makes this an interrogative sentence. And then lastly, we have an imperative sentence, which is a sentence that doesn't have an explicit subject syntactically. So something like pass the salt. It's just a verb phrase by itself, it turns out. And I know a lot of people get taught in English class in high school or wherever that there is still a subject in this sentence. And yeah, if you say pass the salt, there has to be somebody who passes the salt. There's a semantic subject in that sense, but syntactically there's nothing here in the sentence which is functioning as the subject. It's just the verb phrase by itself. So again, all I'm talking about here is the surface syntactic structure, how that changes between these three sentence types. That's all that defines what's a declarative sentence versus an interrogative sentence versus an imperative sentence. So again, these are just a couple of more examples, like is it snowing again? Again, we've inverted the auxiliary and the subject there to make it an interrogative sentence, or tell me what happened, so on and so forth. These are just verb phrases in the imperative sentence type. Okay, a direct speech, so yeah, each sentence type, each syntactic sentence type is typically or prototypically used for a specific type of speech act. So a declarative sentence is normally used as an assertion, interrogative is normally used as a question, an imperative sentence is normally used as an order or request to try to get somebody to change their behavior. When you use these sentence types for their prototypical function, then you are committing what is called a direct speech act. This is sort of the simplest form of using sentences in conversation or in context. The speech act in this case is going to be based on the literal meaning of the sentence, like pass me the salt. There's no figurative way to interpret that, at least not that I can think of at the moment. You simply want somebody to pass you the salt. However, even though these are sort of the prototypical ways we think of using these sentences in language or in conversation, turns out that a lot of the time, or maybe even most of the time, these speech acts will be used what is called indirectly. So This particular sentence types, like declarative, might be used to serve an atypical function, like you might use it as a question or an order. Whereas you might think that you'd rather use these sentence types for that. You use these indirectly, and that kind of provides a bit of distance from the direct speech act, which kind of sounds more polite, generally speaking, in conversation. And I'm going to give you some examples on the next slide, but basically I want you to sort of pause and think about it with respect to this lineup here. If I just go right across from sentence to function, I'm using these utterances directly. If I kind of cross over the borders here, declarative to order, interrogative to assertion, imperative to question, then I'm using an indirect speech act. Okay, so directly, if I wanted to make an order or request and say, please close the door, the direct way to do that is to use this imperative sentence type, please close the door, so on and so forth. If I want to do this indirectly, I could say, do you think you could close the door? And use an interrogative sentence. So again, we've inverted the auxiliary and the subject here at the beginning of the sentence. That is an indirect question. You might, or you probably think that if I say, do you think you could close the door? It's a little bit more polite than saying, please close the door. Or definitely more polite than just saying, close the door. Direct question would be something like, did Bart get the job? Using an interrogative sentence. An indirect way to ask a question like that would be to use a declarative sentence type, like, I was wondering if Bart got the job. And if I just utter that out loud, sort of apropos of nothing, maybe somebody else would get the hint that that speaker wants you to tell them that whether or not Bart got that job, without it being asked directly as a question. Turns out, like I said, we use indirect speech acts in conversation all the time. They're actually a lot more common than the direct speech acts. Because generally speaking, especially in a place like Canada, people try to be polite when they're talking to one another. So for instance, if you're ordering something at a restaurant, again, not that we're going to restaurants a whole lot at the moment, but you might say something like, I would like the roast beef. And that is a declarative sentence type, but you're using it as an order or request, right? So if you say, I would like the roast beef, and you're sitting in a restaurant, you're not just providing information about your interior mental state, right? Nobody really cares that much to find out what you're thinking about roast beef, but they will interpret this as an order to, bring you some roast beef so you can actually eat it. It's kind of funny. I will mention that, so my wife is Ukrainian, and Ukrainian culture is a little bit different from Canadian culture. And so one thing that's different is that people are definitely more direct in Ukraine. So if you do go out to eat in Ukraine, you don't actually use an expression like, I would like something. You just say, give me the roast beef. And you use it in a direct speech act to make an order at a restaurant. So it takes a bit of getting used to, but in some sense it's nice because people aren't, BSing you that much. So I'll give you an example, another funny story I picked up somewhere along the line. This is, I can't remember where I got this, but I'll just read the story out. So at a crowded airline ticket counter, a harried man rushes to the front of the line and demands, I have to be on this flight, and it has to be first class. Then a ticket agent says, I'm sorry, sir, I'll be happy to try to help you, but I have to help these other folks first. The harried man says, do you have any idea who I am? The ticket agent responds by saying, may I have your attention, please? We have a passenger here at the gate who does not know who he is. If anyone can help him find his identity, please come to the gate. And this is a really nice example because it turns out that every single utterance in this particular sequence of utterances in the conversation is an indirect speech act being used for something other than what it appears to be being used on the surface. And that's how the ticket agent kind of takes advantage of that fact here at the very end. So the harried man says, do you have any idea who I am? He's not actually uttering this as a question to try to get information out of the ticket agent. He's trying to make an assertion about his importance in life because I guess if anybody knows this guy, they should know that he's super important for some reason. But if you read that literally, you can kind of turn it on its head and make a funny sort of twist by saying, like, we have somebody here who does not know who he is, which is what would be the case if this question was being used in a direct speech act. Okay, I'll let you sift through this on your own. I'm not going to walk through the specifics of how each one of these work as an indirect speech act, but each one of them is, which is kind of cool. What I do want you to do, though, is to go back to your regular life, and hopefully you're still interacting enough with people to pick up enough of these sorts of speech acts from regular conversation. And if not, you can grab them from other examples you've heard from wherever. But I want you to identify indirect speech acts in your regular everyday life from conversations that you have with other people. How do you do that? So if a sentence contains a verb that is being used performatively, at least I'll let you walk you through how you identify a direct speech act. Normally it's not going to be so obvious, but in some cases you might say, I promise to buy you some ice cream by using a performative verb. If you do that, it's a direct speech act. If there's no performative verb, what you should do is identify the sentence type. Is it declarative, interrogative, imperative, whatever? Those three are what you have to choose from. And then determine whether that sentence type has its typical function. If it's yes, like if you're using interrogative to legitimately ask a question, like, did you turn the oven off? If you're not sure whether or not your roommate turned the oven off, then you actually want to get that information, right? Otherwise, maybe you're saying, I told you to turn the oven off like 10 minutes ago. Why haven't you done it yet? I'm giving you an order. That might be an indirect speech act. So a helpful criterion to use here is to determine how the listener would normally respond to the sentence, and often that's based on the context in which it's being uttered, right? So again, to go back to the restaurant example, if you go into a fancy restaurant and talk to the waiter and say, I would like the roast beef, the waiter is probably not going to say, oh, that's interesting. Every once in a while, I would like the duck, right? So they would rather instead just bring you the roast beef as an order, right? So this declarative sentence is being used as an order in that context. Okay, so you can also think, are any Felicity conditions being violated for the literal meaning of the sentence? So if you ask somebody, like, can you take the garbage out? Normally you would not ask this as a way of deriving information about whether the listener has the physical ability to take the garbage out, right? It's rather instead being used as a request again. So if somebody says, can you take the garbage out? And the person listening says, yeah, I can. I'm strong enough. That's another kind of obnoxious way to kind of turn the indirect speech act on its head. But normally, if a person is decent and responsible, they would just get up and actually take the garbage out, right? So if somebody does not know the answer to this question and asks it, they're probably asking it to draw the listener's attention to the answer in an indirect and slightly more polite way. So that's an indirect request. And this leads me to your assignment. And this is for last homework, so I want you to go out there and find 2 indirect speech acts that you hear or use yourself during the course of your everyday conversations over the next week and a half, and then explain to me why they're indirect speech acts. So I want to let you kind of clue you into this early, so you start looking out for these things in your life, because again, who knows how many conversations we're actually having these days. And I'm going to post the rest of the final homework on Monday of next week in a couple of days to still give you a week and a half to work on it, but it helps to get started on this part early. So if you have any questions about that, also please ask well ahead of time so that I can give you more time to figure it out as well. Okay, I'm going to pause here, and then for the last part of this lecture, we'll talk about the maxims of conversation.